Hi, and welcome to my Deuze vlog. Really appreciate you tuning in on whatever platform and device possible. This is a conversation, an interview, a part of a series of interviews with people, professionals, as well as academics in the field of media work from around the world, who are active in promoting, researching, advocating the notions of mental and physical health, well-being, and happiness in creative careers. These interviews are in part intended to promote and support the work that these people do in journalism, in film and television, in games, in social media and content creation, in advertising, marketing, PR, in music. And in part also to support the publication of a new book on this topic, well-being and creative careers. What makes you happy can also make you sick. That will come out, that comes out in 2025. The idea is to promote a global conversation about these issues and to collectively chart a path forward. In today's interview, I've had the privilege to sit down with Karen Percy. Karen just stepped down as Federal Media President of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, the MEAA, which is a professional association representing creative workers from around the media and performing arts in Australia. Karen has had a distinguished career, still ongoing career, most of her career working for the Australian public broadcaster, the ABC, but also working in Canada, station chief in Bangkok, reporting out of Russia and many other places around the world. She's also been active in many other professional associations, the Walkley Foundation, the Dart Center, Women in Media. So a wonderful colleague, an advocate, a supporter of trauma-informed work and work cultures in the media. And we sit down to talk about her career, her advocacy, what it means to support yourself and others at work in the media, what people as individuals as well as the industry as a whole can and perhaps should do to create a more healthy working environment. Yeah, let's just start, I guess. And again, Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down. I wanted to jump right in. You've just stepped down from your role as federal president at the MEAA, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance.
The media president. I was just the media journos president.
Right.
So
exactly. Yeah. I mean, and that's also already a fascinating aspect of your work and of the MEAA. It's a huge organization. It covers so many different kinds of work in the media and creative sector. And you have been and still are working on its Wellbeing Committee, which, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the first of its kind to be established in these kind of organizations around the world. Can you talk us a little bit through sort of your work at the MEAA, different roles you've played, and of course you're still active, but maybe how you look back on that period from the last 10 years or so?
Sure thing. So, I'm now the immediate past president of the media's section of Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, and that represents some 6,000 journalists. So I've really, really loved that position. I was president for 3.5 years and vice president before that for 4 years. And that you wear a number of hats with that. So while I'm not a staffer, it's a voluntary position. So I'm not in there kind of in newsrooms and in workplaces as the staff are kind of negotiating pay agreements and the like. I'm the person who's supporting and campaigning, and we look at media freedom issues. Julian Assange is one of our members, so that's been, you know, a big important platform and campaign for us, but also looking more generally at the kinds of issues that are affecting journalists and media workers in particular, the work that I have done. And, you know, we have very heavy secrecy laws here in the name of national security. We have really poor defamation laws that make it very difficult to do robust journalism. So there's a lot of issues that we have affecting media freedom. We also have, you know, a huge number of freelance journalists. You know, as the dollars for journalism have been shrinking, media outlets have had to let go a lot of workers. So, you know, we've got a lot of freelance workers, and MEAA has done brilliant work in advocating for freelancers. And I guess that's probably where the commonality really is with our other sections. So we have a musicians section, we have our equity section, which is performers for both live performances as well as film, television, that kind of stuff. And we also have our entertainment crew and sports section, which looks at, as you would expect, the entertainment sector and sort of the Melbourne Cricket Ground. When somebody's taking a ticket, there's probably going to be a MEAA member there. So we've got this really diverse group of people. And for me, as somebody who started their career at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, it makes absolute sense, because the ABC made dramas, it made documentaries, it had crews, it had orchestras, and of course it was in the media as well. So it was nothing really surprising for me. But for other sectors and other people working, it might seem like an unusual coming together of creatives. But in reality, we're the people who are telling Australian stories, whether it's via music or via the stage or film, or just entertaining and informing them. So it makes a lot of sense. And it came together in the early 1990s when there were amalgamations of a lot of different unions. So the Australian Journalists Association started way back in the early 1900s. It's 110 years old. The Australian Journalists Association had one of the very first codes of ethics. So, you know, there's great history here in our journalism and media section. So when we all came together in the 1990s, you know, it was a bit of a bumpy ride initially and trying to figure each other out. But, you know, one of the great, when we do come together, is realizing the commonalities, and that the stories that I tell as a journalist are not that different to the stories that are told via my musician friends and colleagues and those on the stage. So we are, you know, holding history, we're holding to account in different ways, entertaining and informing. So it's really fabulous to see the work that you and others are doing, realizing that the mental health and well-being of creatives, media workers is so important. It is for everybody, but it's more obvious when you look at a police officer or a nurse or a doctor, or those that are in really obvious kinds of roles where mental health is an issue, to understand the difficulties that we do face. You know, one of the real problems that a lot of my colleagues in the non-media sectors think about is that, you know, lawmakers, people think of their jobs as just hobbies. Oh, you're just a musician on the side. No, I'm a full-time musician. This is what I want to do. So there's a real kind of coming together, and we've had to come along to try a long way to understand. And MEAA's Wellbeing Committee started with our performers, our equity folks, our actors, who, you know, would have to de-role. They would get themselves into roles where they would be playing difficult characters or filming those kinds of circumstances. So our equity, my actor friends and colleagues have really been at the beachfront of this, or the beachhead of this in Australia. So I take my hat off to them, but I'm really proud to be part of our Wellbeing Committee now.
And yeah, this notion of that, yes, mental health and well-being is an issue that is at play for a variety of professions, some perhaps more obvious than others, as you say. And in your work, and also in past interviews that I've seen of yours and that I've read, and also during your career as a journalist, as a correspondent at the ABC, you've been a very strong advocate for what you call sort of trauma-informed work. And can you tell a little bit about what that exactly means to you? Maybe also sort of like how you built awareness about that, because that's also something that you and other people in this field often remark, is that especially in creative work, you can tend to be sort of so into it that you sometimes don't even realize that you kind of need help until
Absolutely.
too late. So, how did that, if I may ask, work for you, and how did that inspire your what you call trauma-informed work?
Yeah, so it was probably quite late in my career, relatively, about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, that I really started to understand the buildup of exposure, trauma, exposure of vicarious trauma that I had experienced through my life. As a young journalist in Adelaide, I was also a foreign correspondent. And, there was a military coup in Thailand, or numerous military coups the time that I was in Thailand, and different governments and low level violence the whole time. And it was not until 2014 that I really understood how that had built up in my system. And I was covering a particular case here about a young boy, and content warning, content warning, content warning, a young boy who'd been murdered by his father. He was just at cricket practice one afternoon. His mother was in the club rooms, and that affected me in a major way. And to the point where I did a great job that night, doing the story, because I'd spoken to the mother, and then the next day collapsed in a great heap, because it had that was finally what tipped me over, and people were shocked. It's just like I was the hardened correspondent. I was the one to stand up to the bosses and to talk, and I was the one who could speak my mind about things. And suddenly I was almost rocking in a corner under a blanket, because it had affected me. And that's when I realized what I was going through was just this buildup of vicarious trauma. So I've become a real proselytizer for peer support, which is, as a journalist, as a media worker, reaching out to other journalists and media workers when they've covered similar kinds of stories, and just, because I know what they've gone through, I know what their work flows are like, and I know who they're dealing with, and the deadlines, and the issues they have in actually carrying out their work. But also, I've been there and I've done that. So, and that sort of led me onto a path with the Dart Center Asia Pacifically initially, and then in the US, which is an organization devoted to trauma and journalism. And that trauma-informed approach, and realizing that there are so many better ways of dealing with victims of trauma who I interview, there are some very simple tests and steps that we can take to make sure that we're protecting the people that we're interviewing, but it also protects ourselves as well. And trauma-informed practice is really centering understanding and empathy. And holding space for somebody and giving them agency. So somebody who's been traumatized, who I will sit down and interview, firstly, I'll do a little bit of research to understand what it is they've gone through. Perhaps they've been a child soldier. Perhaps they've been a refugee camp, traipsing the world, coming to Australia finally. Perhaps they've just fled their home from a bushfire, but trying to understand what it is they've gone through. So try to do a bit of research, and then making sure that they're comfortable about what they're doing. Now, sometimes when you're a journalist, you just have to interview somebody where you find them. They might be in their car fleeing, they might be just standing somewhere, but trying to really ensure that people understand what you're doing. So talking through the process, constantly asking, is it okay if? And that's not something that journalists have often done. We usually just barrel in with our questions. So it's just understanding, I'd like to talk about this now. Is that okay? So it's a slightly different approach to journalism, certainly, but it's trying to just ensure that that person has agency. So many people do want to tell their stories. The media gets a very bad reputation for exploiting and sensationalizing, and you've just gone in, and if it bleeds it leads. But I do think that so many of these people actually do want to tell their story. So if we can help them tell it in a way that protects them, so that they feel like they've been able to tell it in a respectful way, and a way that they want to tell it. It's not just about making somebody cry and getting that great moment in television, but it also protects me. It makes me feel better about it as well. So and that's something that I do. I have a little my own little business where I teach trauma-informed practice and understanding what vicarious trauma is. And if I am interviewing somebody who's clearly becoming distressed with the questions that I'm asking, is finding a way to mitigate that, to be much more empathetic and understanding about what you're doing. And it's actually something that we can introduce in so many parts of our lives. It helps me to understand my family. It helps me to understand my friends. It helps me to understand understand strangers, people who I come across in the streets. There are lots of people who are homeless and have mental health issues and drug issues. And I'm not saying I'm able to handle them necessarily, but I've got an empathy and an understanding of what it might have taken to get there. So it's just having heart, and it leads to better journalism. It leads to more ethical journalism. And I think those people who've been involved in the process being interviewed feel better about it as well.
It's yeah, such a powerful notion. It reminds me in academia, there's been a discussion in the last 10 years that, so much of our research is based on interviewing, right? So either surveys, focus group, but there's been some concern about that so much of that work is without heart. So we extract data, but do we really care? I mean, is that care also in our questions and in the way so that's really beautiful. That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And something you've said about this in the past that I've come across in my research as well, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. You talk about how incredibly important or how crucial it is to as you say, destigmatize and normalize conversation about this. And that's almost, I mean, on the one hand, you would go like, yeah, well, of course, we have to normalize conversations about trauma or about, struggling sometimes or about, the entire bandwidth of issues that you could have at work. But apparently that's still a point of advocacy. And
Absolutely.
how does that how do you tackle that? I mean, what's your observation about how the industry is engaging with that, with the notion of stigma or destigmatization?
Well, there are some pretty practical responses or ramifications if you're not looking after your people. Firstly, the Australian government now, there are laws about looking after people's mental health and or making sure that, duty of care, that kind of stuff. And there have actually been a couple of notable court cases in the last 10 years or so where people who've been working with very highly traumatic material have actually sued their employers and successfully sued them. So there are a couple of imperatives. One's a business imperative, and now there's legislation about ensuring people's mental well-being. The Australian media is still very much a macho, male-dominated field, even though I would imagine, and I think there's actually probably 50-50 in journalism. We might even be close to being a feminized industry. But at the very top, it's still very male oriented. It's still very white male oriented. So that kind of the lack of diversity at the top still means there can be a real attitude of toughen up, princess. This is the job, just get on and do with it, rather than understanding, yes, this is the job. You are going to be exposed to trauma. You are going to be exposed to difficult situations, and we have an obligation to knowing that we have an obligation to protect you and to mitigate that. And I think that part is still very much an area that needs to be looked at. And in fact, I will be doing some research as part of a broader piece that Monash University out of Melbourne is doing. They're doing a piece of research looking at community journalists and trauma. And the pit that I'm looking at is actually what we can do within workplaces. I'm trying to look at best practice around the world that we might be able to put into workplaces in Australia, guidelines of rostering, task assignment, interventions, that kind of thing, because we really haven't done a very good job of that, whereas other first responder professions do. And there's become an understanding, certainly on the media side, that journalists are often first responders. They might actually be the first people who arrive at a scene of carnage or murder or whatever. So there is understanding, and the younger journalists I speak to understand the importance of their own mental health. They will take time to look after their mental health. They have strategies in place, but we still don't have the kind of systemic organizational structures that should be there. All organizations have what we call EAPs, employee assistance programs. It's a telephone number you call up and you don't know what you're going to get. And very often it's a person who really doesn't understand the work that you do. It's a contracted organization, and it's very specific. Journalists, when somebody yells fire, journalists are running towards the fire, everybody else is running away. And that's a mindset. That's a mindset that not a lot of professional people who assist in this area can understand necessarily. So finding people who understand what we do is really important. So I still continue to do peer support, even though I'm not in a formal organization anymore. I still help a number of young people, particularly as part of my mentoring, and still will reach out. And when I was the media president, I would reach out to my members at times. But I think that's a really, really big part of the puzzle. And the MEAA Wellbeing Committee, it's something that we're working on as well. So the Wellbeing Committee does a couple of things. We have, in the last year or so, started to do some practical presentations. There was a fabulous presentation just a couple of weeks ago looking at how to be an ally for diverse communities, particularly the trans community. You look at what's been going on in the United States and the anti-trans policies and the pulling of the rug from out of the feet of trans people. So it was, how can we assist? Because they're going through, dreadful anguish, mental health issues. So it was a really valuable presentation just to help us understand, truly understand what it was to be in the trans community and then what they were doing. So we've done some terrific presentations. And of course, Mark, we're going to get you to do one of those presentations as well. But last year, for example, at the end of our financial year, because we have so many so-called sole traders in our union, people who basically run their own little businesses. They're an actor and, they have to do all of their own. They don't have anybody paying their taxes. They don't have anybody paying their retirement. So we actually had a terrific presentation by the Small Business Debt Helpline to help at tax time, because people can get very anxious at tax time. It's just like, oh my God, I know I've got a tax bill. What am I going to do about it? And that adds to your mental health load. And so some trying to offer those kind of practical presentations, but also it's a support group as well, where we could get together and sort of say, this is what I've done this week, or this is what I'm struggling this week. But, we want to be able to formalize it to, at some stage, I would love to see it certainly as something that is setting the benchmarks for what we should be doing in terms of workplace responses. We're not quite there yet, and all of our industries at the moment have so many pressing issues. Artificial intelligence is adding to everybody's anxiety across the creative sector, whether you're a filmmaker, a musician, a journalist. Social media's role in disrupting and misinformation, disinformation, also ripping off artists' work. So we've got a lot of really, really big challenges at the moment. So that we're dealing with, but I would love to see us taking a much more proactive approach in terms of ensuring that there is well-being for our folks who work in major workplaces, but also freelancers as well across our sections.
It seems like it's a complex challenge that an organization like MEAA is in. It seems, because on the one hand, you have this story to tell, this advocacy within the field, within the sector, and making people aware, either that they themselves or their colleagues might be struggling, and how to help and how to be empathic, as you say, and normalize these conversations, removing stigma, encourage organizations to adopt transparency and guidelines and those kind of things. And at the same time, you have that story to tell also to the outside world about, like, yes, creative people have turned their hobby into a career, but it is a career, and it is necessary for us, for our societies, to protect our storytellers, exactly for the reasons you just mentioned, right? I mean, with AI and social media and people feeling like, where are the shared narratives? Well, that's where we turn to our performing artists and to our journalists and to our filmmakers. But hey, we're treating them like the worst of all professions. It's a complex role to play as a professional association, and yeah, you've mentioned the Wellbeing Committee a couple of times, and it's been around, I think, since 2015 or 16 or so, and so this is pre-pandemic, a lot of international efforts in this field have started during or after the pandemic. The Wellbeing Committee started well before that. Can you talk a little bit about its history and why it's such a prominent committee within the association?
I've only been on the committee for about 18 months, since late 2023. So I don't know a lot about the committee. And that was when we were really doing a bit of a push to broaden it out as it started out with our performers, our actors, to
Right.
provide one another with support, and, ongoing resources and ongoing articles about the kinds of things that they can be doing. So, and we've shifted it in the last year just to try and offer a bit more in terms of practical presentations and being
Right.
able to bring different people in. So look, I'm not at the historian on it. I've got a really quite short history with the committee myself, but I do think the work it's been doing, and there are some of those folks who've been on that committee for much, much longer than me who really, understand the importance of providing that support. But to your point about, we now, since COVID, and I think the world is shifting in terms of understanding that there's need for support. There's certainly a lot more organizations out there who are providing lots of great resources,
Right.
online resources or otherwise. And that's a really great thing. But we need to be having them coming together. I feel that one of the really missing pieces of the puzzle is a true commitment by organizations to provide meaningful, authentic support for their workers, but whether they're freelancers, contractors, or actually on staff and on the books. So I feel that that's part of it as well. We get a lot of people ticking a box. We have Are You OK Day. There's, the employee assistance programs, and there's lots of kind of performative discussions about mental health. But I think in reality, some of the things that really matter to people are being valued, are actually workplace industrial issues. It's being valued for the work that you do. It's being paid, remunerated for the work that you do, being recognized and rewarded, as well as having the ability to rest. When I was a day-to-day, these days I freelance and I can pick and choose what I want to do, which is a very privileged position, I know. But when I was back in a newsroom and being sent out to fire fields or sent out to court cases, I would, I was looking at things, you know, dealing with things that were very difficult at times. And if I'd gone out to a fire feed, for example, covering a fire for a few days or a week, coming home and just resting and filling up my fridge and doing my washing was what I needed to do, but my roster said I needed to do another 2 days, and there wasn't any flexibility in that roster. And I think that those are the kinds of things I would see, and this is me personally, because I'm not a spokesperson for the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance anymore. I'm a past president, but I feel as an individual with the experience that I have and the knowledge I have, that's one of the things that you can be doing very easily for your staff, is actually understanding that they need rest, they need the ability to get their lives in order. So I think there are some very, very simple things that we can be doing and getting our organizations to do, so they're not so steeped in the rigidity of, well, we have to have this many people on the roster and this has got to happen, and we don't, and there's no flexibility there. And I feel that that's something that really has to change, because there's a real churn and burn in journalism, especially these days, with young journalists coming through. They may do 6 years, they may do 8 years, they may do 12 years as a journalist, and then they're gone. I've had a career that is near this year, 38 years I've been a journalist. I don't see young people being able to have that kind of career. Now, certainly in the last 5 years, my career has changed and the trajectory is different. I'm not doing it in the same way. But I just feel that, for the longevity of those wanting a long journalism career, and we need journalists with long histories to be able to look back at what has happened, to be able to hold people to account. If you don't know what's happened, it's very difficult for you to hold people to account. So we actually need senior journalists. We need journalists at every layer, but these days, if a journalist is around for 15 or 20 years, that's now a really, really long career. And I feel that is to the detriment of us trying to tell those stories. But at the current rate, with the kind of intensity of work that they're doing, when I first started as a junior reporter in 1987, I did one story a day.
Right.
Now a journalist will do either numerous versions of that story or they might do numerous stories a day. And there's social media and there's TikToks and there's, the workloads and the deadlines are relentless in this digital age. Then you throw in all this other stuff about the, insecurity of work, the fact that they're now not paid as much. They don't have the career ability and the opportunities, and AI, the threat of AI, the threat of social media. It's difficult to be a journalist. We've got, that whole fake news thing that Donald Trump and other right-wing despots have decided is the way to treat journalists. All of that adds up, builds up, and I think it's to the detriment of certainly the media sector. But I also know that it's, my colleagues who are actors, my colleagues who are musicians, who work on crews, work on film sets and the like, also finding it very difficult because, as you picked up on, there's just not, people aren't valuing what we do in the same way that they did. Anybody can make a piece of music, anybody can
Right.
make a
Yeah.
video. So therefore they think that they've got that expertise, and it's so much more complicated than that.
How, if I may ask, because you mentioned it about your career, like you started in the 1980s, and as you also talk about openly, I mean, after this incredible career, I mean, you were station chief in Bangkok. I mean, you've done all kinds of work at ABC. Um, and then you were made redundant in 5 years, like in 2020, right? And now, as a researcher, I had the privilege of being involved with an Australian research project called New Beats, which was about documenting the experiences of journalists who lost their jobs. And I worked with colleagues in Australia, and I did some of those interviews here in the Netherlands, and we've collected data from around the world. And one thing that struck me about that experience is how much it's shone a light on that the work means so much more than just the work, right? I mean, being made redundant, I mean, it can happen to anybody in any job. I mean, we're living in a capitalist world and all that kind of stuff. You can rationalize it all we want, but for so for all these journalists that we've interviewed, for the media professionals that we talked to, it was sort of this sort of disenchantment, this sort of like, yeah, a feeling of real loss. And then a lot of them would come back to journal, like you, for example, as freelancers, but almost all of a sudden, like almost like as a wounded animal. I apologize for the horrible metaphor there,
Oh,
but
I know. I think it's quite accurate.
so if you don't mind, I would ask you about like how does that experience, how was that for you? How does that shape you? And do you sort of do you yeah is that feeling, does that make sense to you? I mean, like because I'm also asking this because in an interview about that experience, or I think on your website, you said something about, yes, I was made redundant, but it also gives me the chance to pursue my passion projects. And that's something that in my research, I find a lot about people that are still at work. They talk about their work in the creative field, in the media, as a passion project, and which is both incredibly inspiring and exciting, but I'm also sometimes wondering how healthy it is to think of your work as a passion project. Could you speak to that a little bit, maybe?
I think it's a really fantastic observation and probably something I'd never really connected in that way that you have. So it's really made me think. You sent the questions ahead of time, and it has really made me think.
Hmm.
I think the thing for journalists is that it's seriously one of the most interesting jobs that you can do. You get paid to talk to people, right? I get paid to talk to people, pick up the phone and kind of just and then I get to write about it, and I get to have a public platform and give somebody a voice. So it's a calling, it's a vocation, it's a whole lot of things, but it's also just the most interesting thing that you can do. It really is. And I've
Right.
done it all over the world. I've done it in Russia, I've done it in Thailand, I've done it in Canada, I've done it in Australia, and just it
Wow.
really is absolutely fantastic. And you're really privileged. And I've traveled to some incredible places, and I've interviewed and met some really extraordinary people. So that's part of it. That's part of the loss, is that you're not anybody anymore. When I pick up the phone, even as a freelancer, when you don't have that big organization behind you, it's not quite the same. So those passion projects that I've done post redundancy is that I do some work on boards, like a board director. So I did the Australian Institute of Company Directors course, which is a long, kind of difficult course to understand governance. So I love that kind of thing, and stepping up into the media president role at the union, despite being a voluntary position, I had the time to be able to devote to some of those issues that I thought needed looking at. Certainly, I took part in parliamentary hearings and helped craft submissions about what we should be doing about social media and artificial intelligence and the like. So I was able to use my understanding and knowledge of journalism to help to try and hold our lawmakers to account and to get them to change laws and the like. So I've been able to do that, and it's something that I'm still very passionate about, but I'll be doing it in a different way when I figure out what I'm going to do. So there is that real calling, but I do think that's part of it as well, is that because it's hard to let go.
Right.
When I was a day-to-day journalist, I was a court reporter for a number of years, and it's hard to switch off. I'm married to a journalist. I know he's still a day-to-day journalist, and he still finds it really hard to switch off. So when you're reading the newspaper, when you're watching television, it's all part of still keeping on top of what's going on, and you're watching Twitter or you're watching whatever it is. So it's very hard to switch off as a journalist. And I found that now that I can pick and choose what I want to do, that I don't pay attention in the same way. I'm still very well up on things and well read, but I don't feel that pressure anymore. The setting up for the weekend, being on the weekend and setting your week up. When I was a court reporter, I would have to be liaising with our people in the office on a Sunday to kind of set up what I was going to be doing on the Monday. So it's kind of a bit relentless. And when something big happens, you've got to respond and go in. So I think that's part of it. And we are wired differently. Getting back to that, when people say fire, I'm running towards it, not away from it. So I think that's part of the passion, but it's kind of a bit of an obsession, I guess, as much as anything else. But because it really is the most interesting thing that you can do. But I do know in that round of redundancies that I left in 2020, when I left in 2020, there were 80 of my colleagues in Australian newsrooms at the ABC alone. That's not counting the other parts of the organisation. 80 of us left at the same time. So, some have gone on to have, good freelance careers. Most have moved into other areas. It's actually very difficult to maintain a meaningful freelance career. I do limited journalism these days. I was doing a huge amount of journalism advocacy, but that's kind of stepped back since I stepped down. So it's such a part of your identity. And I'm not sure, are you ever a former journalist? I don't know. Are you always just a journalist who's moved into something else? Because I come across so many journalists who may not have worked as journalists for 20, 25 years who still consider themselves to be journalists because it's such an important part of your identity. But I do think it's really made me think your passion project observation, because I think it can be quite dangerous and it can be quite obsessive. And I think particularly when you're trying to get ahead, like I was lucky enough to be a foreign correspondent, and I was lucky enough to travel the world, and I was lucky enough to do so many things. Sure, skill and ability was part of it as well, but I was also in the industry at a time when those opportunities were open to me that maybe aren't so much there for some of the younger reporters. And on my last day at the ABC back in September 2020, the one thing I did say to my younger colleagues was, you're not going to be able to have the kind of long career that I have had. So you need to fight for it, and you need to fight for public broadcasting like the ABC, because so many people don't value it. Because I know how lucky I was and how privileged I've been to have the kind of career that I have had.
Hmm. Um, Something you mentioned just now, and thanks so much for sharing that, Karen. Your membership in all these boards. I mean, of course at MEAA, but Walkley Foundation. You've been active in the Women in Media organization in Australia. Which, when I was looking at all of that and being somewhat familiar with the activities of these various organizations, I mean, it seems that you embody a link between sort of a couple of enduring conversations within, in somewhat problematic conversations within the media industry as a whole, which is about gender and gender discrimination and diversity and inclusion. The media industry is this bizarre industry which is filled with generally very young, well-educated, progressively thinking people, but then it has this structural diversity problem in Australia as much as in my home country, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. And you know, the current debate that we're talking about around health and well-being. I mean, and you've been part of these conversations in all these different organizations. How do you see that link? I mean, what does that link mean to you, if I can ask?
It's about truly reflecting our communities. And that means the journalists who are reporting on it have to really authentically reflect our communities. And Australia is a very, very multicultural country. And yet, looking at our TV screens, even reading our newspaper bylines and web bylines, you wouldn't always know that. There are some notable exceptions. The ABC's done really great work in improving the reflection and representation of its journalists and also the voices that are heard within our media. That's another great problem, is that, you know, we've been dominated by white people, white men primarily, who are still setting the tone in so many ways. The Guardian also does great work on that front as well. They, you know, champion issues that are not always part of the mainstream. We have a very, very conservative right-wing Sky News here in Australia, which is very much, you know, not quite Fox News in the US, but very, very conservative and, you know, got very, very set views. It's, you know, probably somewhat anti-trans, probably somewhat anti-woman, probably somewhat anti-immigrant. News corporations, newspapers are doing, you know, there's lots of great work in News Corp's papers, but there's a lot of bad commentary, in my view, that is, you know, that doesn't stand up to the journalistic rigor that it should. So I think we've got a number of structural issues. It is our commercial television media is very, very male at the top end, very, very white. And part of the issue I see, and it's all organisations, is that all organisations have shed mid to senior journalists like myself. So the mentors, the trainers, the somebody who would walk past a conversation and say, "Oh, you know what? I know somebody who could do that. Let me, you know, let me show you the way," kind of thing. That kind of that super important mentoring and support's just not there in the same way it is anymore. So a journalist might be, you know, left to their own devices much more than I was. I got a lot of guidance as a young reporter, and through my career, some of it I really resented, and now I look back on it and I know how important that was. I mean, God, you don't have to rewrite that. I'm a great writer, you know, the arrogance of youth, but all of that is gone. So the people who supported me, that there's nobody doing that for the, you know, I did it as best as I could, and I know a lot of my colleagues did, but the sheer numbers tell you that there's just so many more juniors and not enough seniors anymore, and even that middle. So that kind of the sounding boards, the somebody to help you lick your wounds. So I think that that's where we're getting into trouble in lots of senses, in that, you know, there's just not the same guidance that there used to be. And so those younger reporters who are very often diverse, they will be women, they might be trans, they're certainly more likely to be people of color than they ever were. And it's hard to maintain momentum and enthusiasm, if you're not being paid very well, if you're on a short-term contract, and if there aren't those pathways. But if you're not getting that encouragement as a practitioner of journalist in your craft, that becomes really difficult as well, as that you can get quite disillusioned quite quickly. And I reference that churn and burn that is happening in journalism. Sure, there are lots of mainstays, lots of journalists who've been able to hang out for a long time, but those who are coming in now are unlikely to stay for very long. And I think that's the real problem. We're able to recruit diverse journalists and media workers, but we cannot retain them. And I don't think we do enough as an industry, as individual organisations, to ensure there's retention. And there's a couple of elements to that too. It's just like we need to make accommodations for those who are not like us. I still walk into places where the toilets have very obviously been designed by white men because there aren't enough of them. The surfaces of a building, don't account for high heels. There's lots of ways that as a woman who's been, white, I've been mostly privileged, and I'm in this, the bulk of the majority population that still doesn't work for me. So never mind if you're of color, that you might have different holidays that you are celebrating, or, if you're fasting. So I think that if we want to legitimately, authentically represent our communities, we actually have to make them feel safe and supported and that they belong. And I think that's part of the missing puzzle in all of that, is that I still don't think sometimes I belong. And I'm a rich white woman who's had all of the privilege that I have had. And I've had very, very many challenges over the years. And particularly being an older woman, the ageism in our industry and in my country is extraordinary. We're all raging with menopause, and we've all got so much to give and can't get a look in. So there are some big structural changes that largely belong to the patriarchy, but also, it took me a long time. I struggled for a long time that Australia is a racist country, and I fear that there's still a lot of elements of racism structurally within our organisations, within our society, within our processes that nobody really wants to have a look at. And you look at our First Nations people who certainly find that every step of the way, the over policing, law and order campaigns that are big in our politics. So I feel that there's a lot of steps that we can be taking, and we're not really doing it in an authentic way as an industry or as organisations. Certainly, MEAA has been very, very big in pushing and trying to ensure that there are diversity clauses in enterprise agreements with organisations so that they do diversity audits, that there's a look at where the career progression, the money, the kinds of opportunities that diverse staff have, and there's been huge pushback by organisations from that. So I think that there's a long, long way to go on that. But if we are to survive as an industry, that is crucial that we are telling the stories that reflect our country in its full, rich, sometimes warts and all history.
Right. I really appreciate something. I mean, all of what you said, but this notion of belonging. I mean, it's something that I've picked up interestingly in research on health and well-being in the advertising industry. One thing that comes out of that kind of research is that where the advertising industry is really struggling on a global scale is people saying they don't feel a company sense of belonging. And I haven't seen that as made explicit in work in other media sectors, but it really speaks to what I mean, what you're saying too, the link between diversity, inclusion, health, well-being is whether you feel safe and whether you feel like you belong in the space where you work with whatever you are, right? Of color, I mean, with a disability or anything else, it shouldn't matter. And the fact that it still does is the link, right, between those topics. So that's a really powerful observation. I really appreciate that. Now, maybe in conclusion, for now, one thing that your work and the work of MEAA and the other organizations that you've mentioned, I mean, something seems to, at least for me, from looking at from the outside as a scholarly observer, in the last 5 to 10 years, something is changing, right? You've already mentioned that younger people coming into the media industry seem to be much more aware of the significance of health and well-being, of taking time off, of having some kind of rules in place, at least for themselves. I noticed that among my students. I'm hearing this from colleagues. The work that MEAA and other organizations around the world is doing and focusing more on health and well-being is expanding at quite a rapid pace from where I'm sitting. So yes, there are significant issues that need to be addressed, as you talked about. but there's also seems to be some kind of momentum in all of this. How do you see this moving forward? Where do you say, well, this is what we need to latch on to. This is where how we can move forward. You've mentioned something earlier about the need for the various organizations to start talking to each other a bit more, or so what's the hook that will enable us to move from, oh, what did you say earlier? That was really like a box ticking exercise to something that is perhaps a bit more structural. What would that be from where you're sitting?
I think it's a brilliant question, and I think a hard one, because I think corporations, um, big and small, have kind of been convinced that they have to do things a certain way, and that and they'll take something off the shelf, and this is what everybody else is doing, so this is how we'll do it, whether it's employee assistance programs or whatever. And I think that there needs to be a real focus on people. And organizations always say they're focusing on their people, and they rarely do. When I started as a baby reporter way back in the 1980s, the human resources department was actually about supporting me. It was telling me what my rights were and how I got paid, and here's the bank and here's that. It was actually about supporting me. HR is now, and whatever you call it, people learning, people culture, whatever you're calling your HR department now, is much more aligned with what it is to protect the corporation. So there's a real disconnect, I feel, between what an organization says it's doing and what it is actually doing. And there's your problem right there. So unless there's going to be a real kind of rethink of the way human resources, people and learning, people and culture, whatever your stripe of the department that should be looking after your people and your staff, because managers come and go, shareholders come and go, board members come and go, but staff
Mm,
are there, they're usually the constant and should be the constant. They are usually the caretakers, the custodians of your organization. And I think that that's a big problem. We've become so corporatized on that sense that we've lost a true sense of what it means to actually protect and understand our people. So I think that's the one thing. I think one of the most important things we can do at this juncture, given what we're seeing going on, particularly the disturbing actions of the United States regime. And I think Donald Trump is running a regime. It's not an administration, it's a regime where
yes,
all the guardrails are now gone and
yes.
nobody is able seemingly to stop it. And it is gendered and it's hateful and it's ageist and racist and all the things. It's reinforcing that white male doctrine of white supremacy, in my view, and this is very much a personal view. So what we all need to do as individuals and in our house committees, if you're a media organization, or my wellbeing committee or your student cohort or whatever, is to really to live our values and to do that and show our values, not in a performative way, in a way that is genuine in helping and looking after our allies who are our colleagues who are being targeted. And I think standing together and saying, this is what it means to be human, and this is what it means to be a community, setting aside our political differences, setting aside those differences and understanding that humanity is what it's all about. Because, so many groups, particularly in the US, their mental health is being impacted. I've seen quite a few videos recently of veterans now understanding what the changes to the Veterans Department in the United States will actually mean. And,
Right.
there's millions upon millions of veterans in the United States. So their mental health and coming back from war zones and the kinds of things that you're doing. So I think that we need to stand strong. We need to advocate in every way we can. We need to call out bad behavior, and that's hard, but there's lots of great resources online about being an active bystander or an upstander in actually saying, no, that's not good enough. It's imperative that we all stand up and be counted and be heard and be there for the people who need us, and recognize and keep an eye out for one another, not just mental health wise, but just generally, because now is the time for kindness and caring. We need it more than ever, and just keeping an eye on our friends and reaching out and making those connections, and empathy, putting empathy back, and caring and kindness, because that's what we need. And it's the only thing I think that's going to get us through this is acts of kindness and acts of bravery, and making sure that we're all standing together as best we can.
Well, that's a beautiful. It's probably also the only and the best thing that stands against AI, right? It's exactly opposite, right? It's like the human, to recognize our common humanity. That is absolutely beautiful. Thank you so, so much for all of this, for your time, and yeah, please keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's very kind of you, and it's nice to be able to rant and rave a little bit. So,
That's
but I hope
also so human.
yeah, yeah.